if you followed Counter-Strike pretty closely in 2017, have you even been a fan of sort of the supplementary content people like myself and Stuchu and Thorin and Sam W and Max Millen and these sort of people have created, you've probably noticed this very repetitive, constant conflict that's come up ideologically. And that's the idea that people like myself and other content creators, analysts, scene people will overrate two teams relative to the position of fans. So these teams are Astralis and North. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have seen these comments, or maybe some of the people watching this video have made these comments where people will say something like, I don't know why you think North is good. They're like not even a top 10 team, or they're a very bottom top 10 team. They're not very impressive. Stop thinking them as like an almost elite team or sometimes an elite team. And then for Astralis, they'll say they're not a top team. They're not a world leader. Well, it depends on the era of Astralis. They've sort of moved from being a world leader down to elite team to maybe now on the edges of elite team. We still don't really know their level, where when Device comes back, they sort of had good results without him, but okay, that's a different topic. But they'll say, they're not the world leader, they're not elite, or now they're not elite. So there's this constant conflict between the perception of these two teams from the perspective of seeing people and from fans or from people without any following who make these comments on Reddit and Twitter and whatever else. So I want to sort of dive into this discrepancy in this video. I have come up with three main reasons why I think this conflict exists. So the first one, I think this contributes to the biggest discrepancy, is the fact that North and Astralis are strong in ways that aren't easily perceptible to fans. So I think fans, because they don't understand the game at a super high level, because they're just very casually following the game, or they're basing off of their own individual experience as a player of the game, they will tend to overrate firepower, because that's very visually it's very easy if you're just watching the stream, if you're just watching the crosshair, to understand how good someone is in terms of kills. Or you can watch frag movies or clips or something like this. It's sort of more easily perceptible than the other two components of the game that I like to talk about, which is tactics and coordination. So I like to make it a three-part thing: firepower, coordination, tactics, rather than just firepower, tactics. But in the case of Astralis and North, I think Astralis is a team who has sort of these less tangible strengths. They have both coordination and tactics. And I think in terms of their coordination, they're easily considered one of the best in the world, along with SK in that aspect. And then I think North is another team who's pretty strong in terms of tactics, maybe less so in coordination. I think that's sort of one of the reasons or a factor in why they will sometimes struggle on the CT side, but will succeed on the T side and win a lot more praise, a lot more plaudits on the T side. But anyway, these factors that make them strong teams are maybe less tangible or underrated because they seem because they're less easily perceived by fans. So therefore, the teams themselves are going to become underrated in the eyes of fans. I think this is a pretty solid, pretty understandable argument. I think this counts for a pretty good majority of why a lot of fans are going to underrate Astralis and North. And I really don't see that big of an argument against that. I think it's pretty plain from what I've seen that's pretty true from at least my perspective. But the second point I haven't seen anyone make, and that is this sort of concept that I've come up with called the Outlier Effect or the Outlier Bias. I don't think this is an actual psychologically proven idea. This isn't like a term that I've looked up. It's something I've sort of created, and I think it's and I don't know if it's like a psychological thing, if it's actually a real phenomenon, or if it's something specific to how we watch Counter-Strike. But basically, my idea for the outlier bias or the outlier effect is that when you watch a player or a team, but let's talk about players first, I think that fans will see a player who's, say, mainly average, but has peaks, really strong peaks in performance, where he looks like a superstar or really extraordinary some games. So that maybe if you average it out, coordinates to just being a very good player or pretty good player, like a good level, star level player, elite player. But then they will watch a player who is at the same level, but he doesn't have the peaks and he doesn't have those peaks. He's just consistently a very good player. And I think when the fans see these two types of players, they're going to rate the first type of player, the player with the peaks, more highly than the second. And I think that's because of just the way we consume Counter-Strike. It's either A, that people are going to overrate this first type of player because the clips of him or the demos of him doing really well are going to circulate. A lot more people are going to see these clips or see these games than just the people watching the stream. So those games are inherently going to be overvalued, or it's just maybe it's not the clips aspect, or maybe it's an addition to the clips aspect. That maybe just in our minds and our brains that these sort of outlier games are going to stand out more in memory, so therefore you're going to weight them higher and therefore weight the player higher in respect to, say, a more consistent player. And I think this definitely comes into play when you think of Device, who's more of a consistently very good player rather than a more explosive, extreme, highlight game sort of player, maybe more like a Magic's in late 2016 or at various points in 2016 towards the latter half of 2016. So yeah, I think that hurts a player like Device, who's more consistently good with just like some occasional very, very good games. And even when he does have those very, very good games, it's less flashy because it's more about him anti-stratting and positioning and more mental opping. But just talking about the outlier effect, I think you can go to the other players where they've also been overrated because of this effect. I think the player that probably most stands out in my mind in this respect is Henny or Hen 1, especially in early to mid 2016, where he was really coming up and he'd have these rounds where it really highlight his sort of skill set, was really aggressive, short range kills, very quick firing speed, very quick reaction time, so a lot of intangibles in terms of mechanics, not maybe intangibles, but aspects of mechanics that are visible that a lot of players can achieve or just, inherently are limited. You don't have the same raw skill set, so he seems really strong because, again, these clips are standing out. These clips get passed around, and maybe just the rounds stand out in memory. So this player gets really maybe overrated, and he hasn't proven to be a star level opera like a lot of people at the time in early 2016 were predicting him to be like the next superstar, the next really high level player. I mean, even in his Immortals team that made the finals of the PGL Major, he probably wasn't the best opera, right? But yeah, so I think players like him tend to get overrated. But I think this also works for teams. I think this effect has negatively hurt both Astralis and North. So in Astralis' case, it's more like they're sort of like Device, where they're more consistently very good. A lot of top fours, a lot of high placings, finals appearance, top fours. Maybe not so many tournament wins. I think their only tournament wins in 2017, looking at premier level events, was the E-League Major and IEM Katowice, but lots and lots of top fours. I think their top four streak lasted from, it might have been even before the E-League Season 2. It was either, they might have made a top four at IEM Oakland 2016. I don't remember specifically. But yeah, from that point, either E-League Season 2 or IEM Oakland, all the way to DreamHack Masters Malmo 2017, I believe, where that streak was broken. Gambit beat them for a second straight tournament, but this time it was in the quarterfinals in a best of three in the PGL Major. They lost to Gambit in the semifinals in a best of three. But yeah, so lots and lots of high placings, just not a lot of wins. But there's other teams, especially I think the team that stands out is Virtus Pro at the very beginning of 2017 and at the end of 2016, where people want to say Virtus Pro is better because they have these peaks. They're like Hen 1 where they have the tournament wins, then they beat Astralis dominantly on Train in the third map of the DreamHack Masters Las Vegas semifinals. Right, they look much better than Astralis in that best of three, where Astralis very, very barely beat Virtus Pro in the last two maps of the best of three finals of the E-League Major. And then Virtus Pro so have these peaks, and then they also have these valleys that people sort of like to forget, like at the WSG European qualifier and the WSG sort of World Finals, I think it was called, where they really underperformed per their supposed reputation as the number one team of the world, and they also pretty heavily underperformed at the E-League Season 2 finals or playoffs, where they only made top 8. So yeah, so VP have like standing out more because of these tournament spikes, these dominant wins sort of hurt Astralis' reputation. And if you go through the year, I think there's other teams like say G2 gets a lot of attention at various points of time because they have that big win at not E-League, but ESL Pro League Season 5 finals and DreamHack Masters Malmo, where there's suddenly a lot of hype around them because they won the tournament. But there's a lot of tournaments where they really underwhelm, right? But it's the spikes, it's the attention-grabbing nature of peak performance. I think this outlier effect that sort of, I think, undercuts Astralis' achievements. But on the north end of the equation, it's sort of the opposite. I don't think they're that consistent of a team. They are, I think, more consistent in gaining or reaching the playoffs than people will tend to remember. I think over the course of the year they made more playoffs at premier tournaments than they missed. But there's a lot of sort of negative valleys, or like outliers in terms of valleys in performance for North. I think a famous game is when North failed to make the playoffs of IEM Sydney when they lost to the Chiefs on that nuke game, right? I think it was a 16-13 to Chiefs or something similar to that, where the Chiefs beat North and sort of knocked them out of that tournament in really surprising fashion because they're, a very nobody Australian team, and that region obviously isn't known for producing a lot of teams other than Renegades, who are only a very average team, or have been a pretty average outside of the top 10 team for quite some time. So there's these negative values, and there's also these, I've talked about this in the Thorns platform video where I talked about my MSL article, where North also have these best of three series where North maybe are coming off of a good tournament win or a good streak, like DreamHack Masters Malmo to DreamHack Open Denver, and then they go into, say, ESL 1 New York, and they're about to have this marquee series, or Epicenter, or IEM Oakland, and they're like about to have this series where they're going to have to break through, and then because of their sort of silly, suboptimal pick and ban phase, they'll sort of pick since the player break, they've only picked, this might have actually changed since I last looked at it, but they've only picked Mirage and Cobblestone for the vast majority of those best of three. So that sometimes when they'll go against, say, a FaZe or an SK or an Astralis on Mirage, on Cobblestone, where yeah, SK is the only really strong cobblestone team. The other two permanent, but SK, FaZe, and Astralis all play Mirage, and then yeah, North can just lose the series 2-0 immediately, look really silly that they made this pick, or they lose even on their own map pick to someone that's supposedly of similar strength, so they don't look very good. It's not a very appealing. It's like a negative valley, and people tend to remember those extreme data points. I think that's just how our minds work. Again, this is just sort of my own theory. But yeah, I think both of those, the sort of outlier effect is both hitting those teams and declining or decreasing how fans perceive them in terms of quality, in terms of world rankings. But the third thing is a thing I sort of was just throwing out there on Twitter today, and sort of caused me to think about this topic, is that, of course, when you see the title of this video, it both stands out that both these teams are both from Denmark. So the most obvious thing that stands out, and what I wrote about on Twitter, was, okay, so they're both Danish teams, and Denmark is a small country. I think a population just a little bit above 5 million, where you can contrast that versus, say, Brazil or North America, who have a lot of very, very vocal fans, and those very very vocal fans can influence the broader conception of the community, or the fans, or the Reddit posters or Twitter users, where people from Denmark, because there's just much less of them, can't have the same effect. Now, Thorn pointed out to me that, okay, maybe NIP is a good counterexample, because, okay, Sweden's maybe not that bigger than Denmark, but I mean, every team is an individual case of why they have fans and why they don't have fans, or how vocal their fans are because of country culture, country size, and, so the legacy of the team. But I think, yeah, NIP have a lot of fans because of their history in the game, their very early success, and sort of the personalities built up by that early success, or the fan bases. But I think, it's sort of broadly, I think it's sort of true that some regions like North America, and specifically Cloud9, because there are a lot of Cloud9's fans because of the history of that team, will have more vocal supporters. Brazil with SK, and formerly the Immoral team will also have a lot more supporters, and I think will be pushed more upward in the public perception because of the vocal minority shifting the discussion. But when I thought about it, there's actually a couple more points when you think about it, just that the fact that these teams are both Danish. So there's like a canceling out effect with these teams, where, okay, so MSL and Glaive, who have a history together, and the in-game leaders of both these teams, and they're both sort of were like a tandem, of like a leadership duo in teams like Western Wolves, and they had like a friendship, and they have a very similar sort of outlook on the game, and that leads to both teams sort of adopting a similar identity. Okay, they're different teams, obviously, and they have different players, and that's going to change how they play, but they have a sort of general base identity, and I think there isn't like a Shocks versus Existence in the French scene sort of dynamic, where there's like very specific sides drawn, and there's all these arguments between fans and maybe even analysts on which side's better, what's the ideal way of playing the game. Because, in the Glaive MSL example, they're sort of very similar people in their overall way of structuring a team. So, it's like choosing between Coke and Pepsi. There isn't like a chocolate versus vanilla, ice versus fire sort of ideological, didactical conflict, right? So maybe this quells the vocalness of the fans, and maybe the fans actually split, even though because they have similar identities, they sort of maybe like both teams. They're not very extreme in their love of shocks, or a more loose French team versus the very tactical French team, right? So I think this also sort of hurts them. And I think just sort of the fact that they're both have similar identities, is going to sort of, well, I guess you also sort of point out that in addition to having sort of similar identities, they're pretty, I mean, in comparison to sort of other scenes, like talking about the French scene again, G2 versus Envious or G2 versus LDLC, there's a huge discrepancy in skill between those two teams. Where in the Danish scenes, both of those teams are pretty high level. And then again, there is a differentiation between Astralis and North. Sometimes it seems like North is just right there with Astralis, especially, I mean, North probably looked better than Astralis at some points in sort of the post-player break 2016 period before Astralis picked up Glaive. But yeah, they're more similar in skill, and again, that might sort of have a muting effect where it's a Coke versus Pepsi, either or similar quality sort of thing, and there's not like a massive migration towards one team or the other team. So yeah, I think all three of these factors, the fact they're more tactical and coordinated, which fans underappreciate, and that now lead to fans underappreciating or undervaluing Astralis and North. The fact that I think there's this sort of outlier effect that hurts Astralis in terms of them being consistent, and North having these negative peaks or negative valleys. And three, that the fact that they're from the same country, and that sort of affects how fans react to them. And maybe they're not as extreme in their devotion as something like a North American scene or a Brazilian scene.